Welcome back. Welcome back. Welcome to the roundtable discussion. And with this roundtable, we want to shed more light onto Europe and wars, or the new wars that have been going on, and show current challenges of today's world. And what we thought with this roundtable discussion, that we'll start with very brief opening statements and then just open the floor for a more intense discussion. And we thought we'll start with that question. Is this on? Yes, right. We will start with a question: how does Europe deal with the new wars, the new armed conflicts that are coming up? And who wants to start? Maybe Claudia, because you had some specific ideas in mind.
Yeah. Okay. So, is Federica there? Okay, that's good. Is Doris there?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. And Oriol has he returned? Okay, that's even better. So, because the idea was to present a book that Knut Erik has been referring to already. Last year, about at the same time, we met in Fulda and we discussed with a couple of EU scholars the implication of the war against Ukraine for the European Union in various respects. And there is a book that is an outcome of this, and the book currently is in production. So we thought it would be out, but it's going to be out probably in the January or February next year. So the proofs are just arriving. I'm co-editing this book with Michelle Knott, who is a professor in Darmstadt and who cannot be here because she had since a long time an appointment in Berlin. So many good reasons not to do like an explicit book presentation. However, Doris has been contributing to the book, Oriol has been contributing to the book, Knut Erik has been contributing to the book, I myself has been contributing to the book, and Federica has been kind enough to write an endorsement for the book. So she has read the first manuscript. Now, the idea that I sort of then had was, since the topic of this conference is Europe in the world, to sort of combine the two. And that will be our task tonight, or in the coming 60 minutes or so. Because the war against Ukraine is not the only war the European Union is facing in the moment. Okay, obviously we know that there are armed conflicts going on in many parts of the world, more or less all the time. But so far, Europe has used for a long time the privilege not to feel that much concern. This is something that people often reproach to Europe, like you don't care what happens in the rest of the world, and then suddenly if something happens in your backyard, you are shocked because, oh my God, there is a war. Yeah. But still, I mean, I think that's probably a kind of a human mechanism that you are used to conflicts having in, faraway parts of the world. And then when something happens, like literally in your backyard, you obviously feel more concerned. So the idea then really is to take up the most recent war and discuss it together with the implications of the war against Ukraine on the European Union. So now let me make my points and why I think the two are related. Europe and the new wars. So first of all, I try to be as brief as possible. So it's going to be bullet points that I throw at you. The war against Ukraine was a shock. It was a clash of certainties for the European Union. It was a reality shock. So there had been talk about a multipolar world order, but many Europeans, especially Germans, have been believing in this change through trade metaphor. So for a European rationality, I think it's very difficult to understand why Putin could attack Ukraine. It's costly, many people die, so there's no rational reason for attacking another country. And the logic behind is difficult to grasp. So Europeans, citizens and politicians with the shock realize that we live in a multipolar world. And I once more have to agree with Knut Erik. no more normative power. So, okay. No more normative power. Oh no, okay. No more normative power. Those days are over. Yeah, we are no longer, so we can claim to be a normative power. It's not going to work. No change through trade, apparently, and that's, if you ask me, something that hasn't been thought through, because it doesn't only concern Russia; it concerns many other countries in the world. War is a reality, and as we heard in the first panel, the European Union is not very well equipped to deal with this reality. So there is a kind of desperate search since 1.5 years about what to do. And we have this claim for a geopolitical Europe, so von der Leyen and Borrell, claiming that the EU has to become a geopolitical actor. Last year, in last year's lecture series, I had a German Green MEP, Reinhard Bütikofer, who was giving a presentation and who told the students, the question for Europe is whether it sits at the table or it is on the menu. That was a Green MEP, that was his expression. So he was even using more stronger terms than the Christian Democrat MP. So there is a conflict, and there is an ideational conflict too. It's the question whether it is the West versus the rest, or is it liberal democracy versus autocracy, or is this about the defense of the liberal international order? There are values at stake, quite apparently, and the question is which one? And let me sort of add another quote. Last Tuesday, as I said, we had a very interesting talk from some alumnus students of ours who works for the European Council Communication Department. And he told us that the last 3 times a flag was projected on the Commission building, it was the Ukraine flag, the rainbow flag, and the Israeli flag. So that tells you, I think, a lot about the ideational positions that the European Commission takes. Unfortunately, this doesn't really work very well with the rest of the world. The rest of the world doesn't necessarily buy into this. It doesn't necessarily agree with the European values. One chapter in this book that we will then present later covers perceptions of the war against Ukraine in the rest of the world. And it turns out that the European states, unsurprisingly, are mostly in favor of the Western reaction and the defense of Ukraine. And that many other countries, and in many other countries in the world, not only the governments, but also the population are not of that opinion. So there is much more understanding for Russia out there in the rest of the world with citizens and with politicians. It's also that I think we painfully realize that the rest of the world, which is, if I can say, in terms of citizens and in terms of countries, the majority of the world, increasingly claims that the West does not live up to its standards. And I think Europe has to face that what Europe has to offer to the world is not that much, except wealth. This is why a lot of people want to come to Europe. So, as I said, the normative power doesn't work. The change through trade thing, there's a question mark. So, and then the question is, what does all this tell about the EU's capacity to act in this situation? So in the Ukraine war, there has been a limited but largely present capacity to act. So they were, I would say the EU member states were not always of one opinion, but I think largely they managed to agree on sanctions, even if there were controversies and conflicts. And I would say the situation is different now with this second new war. So we have this war in the Near East. We have a decades-old conflict that has very deep historical roots. We talked about it in the coffee break. It's almost impossible to disentangle them from one another. And that exploded anew. And it underlines, I think, most of what I just said. So the question is, what is the role of the EU in that? Where's the capacity to act? And I think we can see that it is much more limited than in the Ukraine war. So there is sort of the UN resolution on the Near East war, and I think, are very far from well, not even to think about unanimity, but there were really very different votes in the UN General Assembly from the EU countries. So it's clearly visible that the EU countries have very different positions, They don't act jointly. There are very different traditions also behind it. So Germany has a very specific role here. Belgium has another role. There are very different histories in the member states. And all this, I think, it's not only that interests. So the EU probably is used to having very different interests. Apparently that can be worked around, but when it comes to traditions and positions, then it seems to be much more difficult. So I would say that the EU has to face all these challenges, and we will have to, I'm afraid, very concretely think about how to deal with war. But it seems to be really a large challenge, and a large challenge because of all those differences and because of reasons that we have only started to think about. That's my introduction to the topic. And I can just hand over, and then we have the people online after Knut Erik. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. And so the kickoff question is, how did the EU respond to the new wars? And I think the short version is to say that the EU sort of reacted by modeling through in a piecemeal fashion without any sort of strategic thinking behind it. It was a unprepared engagement in responding to the outbreak of the wars. It was also an inexperienced actor who responded. And for that reason, it has been several very steep learning curves that the actors involved in decision-making has been involved in. I think also it's not only sort of the diplomatic service at the EEAS, it is also the intelligence services in member states that apparently were caught by surprise that in February 22, Russia attacked Ukraine again. Seemingly in contrast to the United States that kept everybody who cared to listen informed them about what was about to happen. But I think on the European side, the intelligence service has to engage in some really serious soul searching about what they do and what they apparently cannot do. At least it is well known that when the war against Georgia broke up in 2008, it was known in Moscow among the diplomats there several months before it happened. But apparently this time they were all caught by surprise. That is not sort of a serious international actor that is in that position. Then, as I mentioned in the afternoon, what I'm going to propose is that the European Union has to begin to prepare for war. Of course, that is a 100% political statement, and you can take it or you can object to it. What I can do is only sort of to present the analysis that lead me to that prescription. And that includes that what the European Union has been doing so far in the proximity of preparing for war is to do some experiments in strategic autonomy, as also Auriol mentioned in his presentation earlier today. It has also, the EU has also adopted a strategic compass, but that is more sort of a paper operation than it is operational planning for warfare. Then, of course, armaments is part of preparing for war, and it has been some acceleration in that area, but still the 1 million artillery shells that the EU has promised Ukraine are not coming through yet because the capacity is not as it was supposed to be. It is about also the ministers of defense actually meeting on a regular basis, which they do not yet. If the ministers of defense do not meet on a regular basis, how can you prepare? How can you plan anything? It's then going to be, as the reaction has been, piecemeal, inexperienced, unprepared. Now, Why is it that the EU needs to prepare for war in my analysis? It is because we are only 11 months from the US election. We don't know the outcome. We know the outcome last time and the time before, and we know how disruptive a Trump presidency can be. This time round, should he win or somebody like him, it will be even worse. That is, I guess, predictable, because in the meantime, the US has polarized even more than it was when Trump won. Then if we look at the various major actors around the world, Russia is, for all sort of reasons, the first to mention. And what is it that we can sort of read about Russia in the news media? And here I only count sort of the more trustworthy news media. We never know who is playing games with us readers of the news or the viewers of news shows on TV. But apparently Russia is actively involved in hybrid warfare. Yesterday it was busing some 1,000 migrants up to the Finnish border. In other cases, it has been other ways of waging hybrid warfare. There has been for the last 5-7 years continuous simulated attacks by bomber jets to EU and also Great Britain. And there has been a strange interest in critical infrastructures, both in the Baltic Sea, in the North Sea, and elsewhere. This has also involved the engagement in conflicts in Africa, not by Russia itself, but by the Wagner Group. Concerning China, for a long time, East Asia has been one of the most insecure regions in the world. And with the activities in the South China Sea, I don't see that will get better any soon. And even peace-oriented Japan has decided to do sort of a U-turn and begin to actually prepare for some serious conflicts with China. So in general, it seems that international society is crumbling. The rules and the norms that used to characterize international society seems not to be as strong as they were just 10 or 20 years ago. It also applies to the multilateral system. Fewer and fewer states want to invest in the multilateral system, and more states want to take something out of the multilateral system, whether it is to sort of disbanding current practices, or it is to expect more than states are willing to invest in the system. And given that it's not sort of it's not a system that is self-generating all the values that it provides, it depends on the member states of various multilateral institutions. How is it possible to conclude anything else that the multilateral system is experiencing one of the worst crises, if not the worst ever? Finally, as also Claudia has mentioned, the EU is not sort of in a powerful position. Maybe the EU was led 20 years ago, but that was 20 years ago, not any longer. The EU has been in decline. It has been observed. It has been reported in various articles and books since then. But still, people tend to believe that the EU is very powerful, and for that reason should be sort of blamed for all sorts of evils that the EU is doing. The EU can do less and less, and for that reason we have to reorient ourselves and sort of the directions of criticism that are directed against the EU or against other actors in the world. So I think I'll finish on that note.
Thank you. So for our online or speakers that are participating online, who wants to go first? Federica Bicchi, do you want to start?
Yeah, and I'm really sorry that I'm not there in person, because it would be good to read the room at this stage. And I risk, being undiplomatic and terribly, terribly politically incorrect, which I know could be a bit of a thing that should not be done. But I'm going to contradict Knud Erik point by point, because I must admit that it seems to me that the EU is not in decline. The EU is doing really well. And the risk is that we talk it into decline. It has been preparing for war quite substantially. If we think about, the facility for peace, it has been totally transformed into something that has very little to do with peace. If we look at the international partnerships, they are overwhelmingly about managing migration. The amount of money that the EU has spent in its southern neighborhood in relation to building walls or projects about managing migration is scandalous. So it seems to me that if we want the EU to do something, it should be instead to prepare peace. Because it seems to me that it is not by chance that we have war in the neighborhood. It is in the east, it is in the south, it is very close in the Balkans. And therefore, I wouldn't say that this has been sprung onto the European Union, but rather that European foreign policy in the last 10 years, 15 years, has been overwhelmingly defensive. And therefore, maybe a different idea is to consider all the good things that Europe stands for and try to imagine them in a more internationalist take. But obviously, I am appalled by the violence in Ukraine, the violence that happened on the 7th of October, and the violence that is ongoing in Gaza. And I think that this is a blotch on Europe's record. But at the same time, I wouldn't overemphasize the divisions between member states. Because if we, on Israel and Palestine, I know what I'm talking about because I've worked on this. If we go back 10 years, there was a lot of unanimity about what to do with the two-state solution, how to isolate the settlers, etc. But then, not much happened. And there was a sort of a co-participation in this idea that the conflict would just go away. And it didn't happen. What should Europe do now? It should engage. It should absolutely engage. 100% go out, put their face on some ideas that have been around for a long time. Not just about, for instance, revoking visas to violent settlers, but considering the type of political debate, the quality, the poor quality of the political debate when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it seems to me that that's where the wealthy and privileged minds that live within Europe should focus their efforts. But I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. So after having heard quite contrasting views of Europe is in decline, Europe is not in decline, I would ask Doris Vidra and Aurel Costa, would you agree? Would you disagree? Maybe Doris, would you go first?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for having me online. I'm also very sorry that I cannot participate in person, I think being there in person always enlivens also the discussion. Now, the question whether I disagree or agree is actually hard to answer, because I see a lot of value in both positions, and this raises for me the question, now how do we measure the strength or weakness of the European Union? How can we assess whether it is in decline, whether it is strengthened? I think what we see is, and this brings me back to what Claudia has said in the beginning, that we have a lot of criticism. We have much less answers to what to do now about. When Federica says, well, the European Union has done a lot for the last years, and I think in particular the foreign and security policy was an area where we have seen a tremendous activity. But the question is, now we have seen this activity, we have seen the money spent, we have seen all these initiatives, but can we effectively make use of this in case we need it? So for me, this is an essential question. Are we able to take the right decisions at the right time? So when it really is necessary. For me, the real question now, and I'm working a lot on contestation. So, and this contestation is something, of course, that I see everywhere, because again, Federica says we have a lot of unity on many aspects, but then again, we also have a lot of disunity, and I think the conflicts we see in Ukraine, but also in Israel, between Israel and Palestine, is really raises the question of who is the European Union? Where does it stand? How can it engage in such conflicts? And we often talk about the EU, talking about the flags that were highlighted on the Commission building, so that we look at the Commission, but then we have the member states. And here we see a lot of contestation going on, even more so if we do not understand the member states as black boxes with a national interest to be followed. But when we look at the contestations going on inside the member states, within the societies of the member states, and often making it also difficult, having elections in mind and everything going on, to take a clear stance. When I look at Hungary, opposing a lot of decisions, when sometimes I ask myself, so when we talk about the multipolar world, are all member states still on the same pole on the issues? Yeah, so, or how are differences here also used to bring forward one's own issue? So I'm really undecided. I see that the European Union, as European Union, has done a lot, has managed a lot, but at the same time, when crisis hits, we are in the same position as always. We muddle through, we somehow manage, we are never prepared. And the question is now, for a geopolitical union to be geopolitical, it needs something else. It needs preparedness, it needs strategic thinking, and not in a way sitting there and hoping that the next crisis will circumvent us somehow, because we would again be hit by it, and somehow have to manage to keep the balls up.
Thank you. Ariel, do you want to respond to that, or give a short statement to the question how the EU or Europe deals with conflicts as such?
Yeah, my concern here is that we might be underestimating the fact that like the centrality of the post 1945 conceptions of sovereignty for the EU and for integration and for everything the EU has been able to develop, right? So it's the EU is embedded or built into this post 1945 conception of sovereignty, and everything we can do depends on so far on that Lord to hold. And I think that we should take into consideration the fact that you know, to the extent to which the war in Ukraine and perhaps other trends as well are opening big cracks in that norm, right? It's the war in Ukraine is a war of aggression, a classical war of aggression, a war of choice, a war of annexation, right? It's everything the UN Charter and contemporary conceptions of sovereignty tells us that should not exist, right? And I think that this in a way changes the game of war and peace and conflict around Europe, perhaps beyond that, but at least around Europe, to an extent that we had not foreseen. We should have foreseen it for sure. I would like to point you all to two excellent pieces that I always read and reread with amazing of how prescient they were. There's this paper by Stefanowa published in International Affairs 2015, Kalschmidt in the Kremlin. And then there is this other paper by Roland Paris in I/O 2020, The Right to Dominate, how old ideas about sovereignty pose new challenges for world order, which looks not only at Russia, but also China and US Trump. And they all actually were warnings, of course, post Crimean accession warnings, of course, right? So they were both of them warnings of cracks opening in this conception of this post 1945 conception of sovereignty. I think this is critical for us. It's critical for Europe for a couple of reasons. The first one is that all European-centric, so to speak, if you wish, non-Atlanticist approaches to providing security in Europe were based on the idea of mutually recognized borders. It took a while to have that in Europe, right? It took a while to have mutually recognized borders in Europe after the end of World War II. But reaching that point was instrumental, or actually part of what Ostpolitik was about, or what the Helsinki Act was about, that the CSCE was about, right? So all these, and then of course the Paris 1991, right, on the new Europe. All of that was based on the idea that borders were recognized and could not be changed by force. Right? So by making borders unsecure, I think that makes everything the EU is able to do much more complicated, or much more dependent on the US as a security provider in Europe. Right? All those European-centric initiatives were predicated on mutually recognized stable borders. It's only through stable borders that you can make borders irrelevant, right? The other way you make borders irrelevant through integration, and that's how the EU has dealt with many of its issues within and beyond the EU, is based on the assumption of stable and recognized borders. And secondly, because the war in Ukraine is a huge shift of the goalposts for EU relevance. It makes EU relevance in security matters much more complicated. We move from crisis management to territorial defense. Once borders cannot be taken for granted. Once you erode the norm of sovereignty as understood after 1945, you need to start taking care of territorial defense. And territorial defense is something that is really beyond the grasp of the EU right now. Even with all the things that the EU has done in the last few years, or the last a couple of years after February 2022, whatever we think about each of those things, right, and our normative positions on that, the EU is really very far away from being able to be relevant on its own territorial defense, as opposed to crisis management. I mean, the EU has been announcing headline goal after headline goal on crisis management. It has always been very difficult for the EU to come up with the right mix of forces and the right integration of forces and so on to be able to do that. But that was at least part of the goals that the EU was posing for itself, even if delivering them was another matter. Territorial defense is really much farther away. We have much less internal cohesion on that. We have less capabilities. Everything about actorness, from preference cohesion to autonomy to capabilities, is scores lower when we move from crisis management to territorial defense. So my impression here is that we should not underestimate the extent to which EU integration and EU foreign policy and EU security policy is dependent on a particular network of norms that pivots or is articulated around or is premised on the outlawry of war accomplished of wars of aggression, of course, accomplished in 1945. And this war is, this norm is cracking. I think this is really a game changer in EU security.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the various perspectives and also positions into the question of the roundtable. I would now open the floor and include the audience for a larger discussion. And yeah, if you have comments, questions, please just go ahead.
Hello, Salamat. Hi, my name is Omar. I'm doing mass human rights. I'm really concerned about European foreign policy, and especially related to security. I'm from Sudan, and Ethiopia has a project is called the Khartoum process, which is this project focused on management of immigration management. And that money is going to rapid fund support, which is for many years. Those rapid support, the violation human rights in Darfur, called Janjaweed, and everything, but still, European Union will support them to just control the immigrations. And due to that fund, that this rapid support now become like start a war with the country. And now, according to UN, the people had been displaced in the country. It is around 7 million. And people who cross the border in 1 million facile 1 million. And I don't know how this project is not just lead to control the immigration more than destroy the country, actually. So I'm really ready to comment on that. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. So the question was more regarding the immigration. Who would like to react?
And accepting negative externalities as a result, letting people die in the Mediterranean or allying with the Janjaweed, which is a militia that committed genocide in Darfur. And I think that's what the question is about, right? If I understood correctly. Yeah, sorry, I was just
1 million has been crossed the border. 7 million has been displaced in the country. So, and that's just because of the policy of controlling the immigrations.
So I will try. So let me say that sort of what I said this at the beginning of this day, that it gets increasingly difficult to sell the European Union to students, because there are things that I don't want to, no, but there are things that I cannot defend, and there are things that I don't want to defend. And I teach my students Article 2 of the EU treaty, so you probably came to point alpha, so we have been discussing that. And it's always a problem when what is put on paper is not put into practice. So I'm not going to say something different as a professor. That is sometimes a bit tricky, because in Germany they have this tradition that they expect professors of European studies to be always pro-European in any case. But I never signed like a treaty of absolute loyalty to the European Union. I'm not going to do that. Yeah. So so on the contrary, I would always opt for being critical informed citizens, and in that case, critically informed academics. So that having said, you got a point. And I think this point is, if you ask me, very virulent for what we have been discussing here. For the question, has the European Union been working well, or hasn't it been working well? Because I think that the issue of immigration into Europe is not one that can be solved like with clean hands. There is just no easy solution that I know of. There are solutions that are more or less bad and have normative problems. So I know I'm not an expert on migration, I have to say, but I recently read something that sort of seemed rather intelligent, and it was a kind of combination of having skilled migrants, so the ones that are very welcome and needed in Europe to come to Europe, and then regulation, and then quotas for refugees, that kind of thing. So that's at least probably in normative terms a nicer image than the things that you were describing, and then detention camps at the borders. But you know, there is no good solution, because the problem is just that sort of Europe economically and in many other terms is better off than many other parts of the world. But Europe won't let all the rest of the world into Europe. That's just not possible. So that's sort of the problem that we are facing here. So we are talking about not having a good solution. So what the European Union does, and I think that's a normatively not so nice way of mingling through. So I think was it Doris or was it Federica? I think you both mentioned this way of tackling crisis. So they mingle through, they try to find a solution. Well, they try to do sort of what is at hand. So if you ask me, but that's my interpretation, that's sort of the strategy behind dealing with autocracies and dictators and militias. That's a way to try to get hold of the problem. My specificity is more governance inside the European Union and democracy and legitimacy. But even there, in crises like the financial crisis, you saw a similar direction. So authorities of the EU just trying to get hold of the problem, irrespective of them violating democratic standards that they themselves fixed in their treaties. Yeah. So what can I say? I cannot defend that. I think there is an explanation. I think the explanation is a very much realpolitik one. Yeah. So desperately trying some solution. But it obviously is, it in my view, it creates not only like a normative problem, it also creates a legitimacy problem. Because when you put values on paper and going out and claiming to the rest of the world, would you please accept that? It's not valid for us, but can you please accept that? That's the problem that the US has had for years. And I think this is also something that we see coming to a stop in the world. So the rest of the world now really understood, okay, you have been playing this game for 40 years. We see clearly through it. So why should we respect values that you don't respect? So yeah, so it's not a nice, I think it's a symptom of what we have been discussing, but it's really difficult to get any satisfying answer to that.
Yes, I have one reaction and one question. So, but on this topic, I mean, I think it raises also the question of what the EU you know, is and should be as an international actor. I mean, when we have these workshops, we sort of complain about the EU not being a relevant geopolitical actor. I mean, we can see its failures in that sense. But then I think the question that this raises is, you know, does the EU have to sort of give up its values in order to become a relevant geopolitical actor, or can we combine, you know, both, you know, having a relevant role and actually also pursuing those values? I don't have a good answer, but maybe you do. So my second question, my original question, was related to what Knut Erik brought up with his controversial statement in the beginning that we need to prepare for war, since the US election is just around the corner. So my question is, what will happen when Trump wins next year? What will the EU do? So please give me the answer.
Should we collect a few responses? Yeah, in the interest of keeping the conversation going. So thank you all for very interesting interventions. I was thinking that obviously, I mean, Knut Erik, you're I think pointing to a very important thing, and also in your previous intervention, right, where you were saying that we need to grapple with war better, or we do a better job at kind of incorporating it in our thinking about what it is that we're studying when we're studying the EU. But I guess the kind of part of it is obviously that it's so inherent. I mean, it is a tricky exercise to be very cool and analytic about war. And of course, a lot of stuff that we knew from other disciplines in history is that war has a tremendous transformative power. It is one of the human practices that really shapes and reshapes human societies, right? If you look at Piketty, for instance, one of Piketty's great observation in his book is that, you know, if capital always beats labor, right? The accumulation of capital over time always beats labor and the return of profit from labor until war or major disaster happens, and then you will have some kind of an nivellation going on in a sense. So of course, war has a huge transformative impact, but it's also something that, you know, for us as humans, we can't really. It's very hard to kind of what do we make with that kind of insight? How do we do that in a way that also kind of, I don't know, aligns with our social science ethos, where we actually think of. But I mean, I guess most of us are here to do something because we think that social science is emancipatory in a sense, or should be in a sense. So to me, that it's not difficult for us to understand that war is extremely important, but it's just that what do we do with that insight in a sense of social science? That's something that would be interesting to hear your reflections on in the panel. And then two quick things. One for Federica. I think you're very, you know, your observation that a lot of stuff that the EU has been doing has been detrimental. A lot of the stuff that the EU has been doing, trying to achieve security, has been very defensive and actually counterproductive, and has been detrimental to the security not only of European society, but also societies in partner countries. Yes, but do you think now that and maybe this is also, you know, tying into what August was just saying, do you think there is some kind of a hard choice or dilemma now for Europe and European member states where you would somehow try to, you know, make a decision? Are we supporting Ukraine because Ukraine cannot lose against Russia, because of course the effects of that is going to be so detrimental, and therefore we need to somehow, you know, not spend as much on development, not spend as much on humanitarian aid or something like that? If there is a hard choice here, how should we navigate that dilemma in a sense? I think that's important. And then for you, Oriol, I think you also made a very great observation on the kind of the norm of sovereignty and how we have thinking about that and the role of kind of, you know, having stable borders. But are you seeing any shift in the norm in Europe, right? I don't think that, you know, that a lot of learning, so to speak, is going on in European capitals where, you know, Stockholm is thinking, maybe we should do land grab. Maybe we should erase 1905. Norway should belong to Sweden. Let's go back to what we had before. So I mean, are you seeing that? Because obviously it's not that. So obviously Russia did something. Russia violated the norm. Maybe we pretended that they, after Helsinki were playing the game, but I don't know. The Helsinki Accord actually said that the Soviets could have it basically, and then came the end of the Cold War, and then the West said no, we're not going to respect the borders of the Soviet Union, and then Russia got pissed off. So I don't know how should we navigate your observation on the kind of the role of norms for sovereignty? I guess who is that norm for, and who was buying into that norm to begin with, is my question. Thank you very much.
Just a very brief comment. Well, thank you for all the participations. Are quite inspiring and are leaving me quite concerned, about what is coming in the future. I guess that what I see on the one hand, I guess that Knut has a very strong point regarding the external environment. Because it's the first time that we have a territorial invasion, in Europe, since 1945, the role of Russia, the United States hesitating in the international role. So it's concerning all those external variables that to some extent, I guess that should send some red lights about to do something. And on the other hand, I guess that what I have heard for a long time about EU security is that mostly, and also I like the question about Africa in general, the conflicts, the role of the EU in Africa and in other places, that the response is, well, we have created an instrument. We are allocating certain millions of euros, and we are somehow helping to mediate certain conflicts. But if we put it in a larger scale, perhaps what the EU has been doing for 20 years with many programs, aid, is very little in the greater spectrum. And I guess what is relevant, and this leads to the relative decline of the EU, is that the impact of those millions of euros, many institutional innovations that are important, are not having that impact. If we put both together, it's just actions of the EU that help to strengthen security, but are not enough, and an external environment that is, I guess, for the first time, we are facing. I guess that the relative role of the EU is on decline, because for a long time, let's forget normative, geopolitical, simply the impact in many of the conflicts in many confines in the world is very limited. And it seems that if your very negative predictions come to be a reality, the EU is unprepared for a war, It's just a comment. I don't know if this will provoke any reactions.
I think we have one last question, and then we would close with a round, maybe. Yeah.
I'm Alex. I come from Cameroon. It's not actually a question, it's a statement. The professor actually said that European countries are one of the best in the world, and that's why people want to migrate to Europe. Actually, no, I didn't want to come to Germany because I had a choice. It's because I didn't have a choice. And if you look at the world as a whole and the influence of colonialism, and I'll talk about France, I'll talk about my country. The French colonized us, and we are still under the French rule. My president has been on the power for 37 years, and that's because of France. Many African countries that have been colonized by France are still under the French rule. And every president in the French region of Africa that tried to stand up against France was killed and assassinated. I'm talking about Sarkozy, I'm talking about many of them. If we migrate to Europe, as you say, like that's the best, it's because we do not have a choice. I didn't come here because life is better. I came here because life didn't give me a choice. And I came here because of France. I came here because of colonization. I came here because of the EU. And if you kill our people in the Mediterranean Sea, if you kill our people when they want to cross the border, it's because we do not have a choice. Europe didn't make our countries better. It made our countries worse. French still steal money from us every year. French takes money from African countries till today, and it is written. And each and everybody in the AU knows that. I am sorry, but we do not migrate here because we want to. Germany does not give me a better life. It gave me the worst life in my life, but I do not have a choice. I came here because I do not have a choice. Thank you.
So that were quite personal and individual perspectives, and yeah, maybe we can bring that into the closing discussion as well. But there were also some other questions or comments that have been raised. Yeah, maybe Claudia, do you want to? Why don't we do the opposite order? Okay, yeah, sure, of course. That's a good suggestion. So yeah, we'll just do a brief closing round so that we'll have another 10 minutes or so, because we have to close soon in order to get to dinner. So Ariel, would you start, and then we'll have like a very brief round, and then
let me say raise a couple of points. The first one is that every time we talk about EU as exposing normative goals instead of interest goals as opposed to other countries, I think we make a disservice to the EU. We make a disservice to our scholarly discussions. There are plenty of different norms and that then clash with each other, and I think that for instance, when talking about migration, I'm not a migration expert, but we need to think of this in terms of a norm that claims that we have a moral obligation with people who live outside of our borders when they are in need, and then there's another norm that is the right of closure, right? And both have a very long history in political thought and in political philosophy, and both clash. And we need to talk about them in terms of the clash of two different norms exposed by two different worldviews. So we need to talk about them in political terms, I guess, or at least in normative terms, not in terms of being able to live up to your norms or not, but in terms of you shifting from one norm to another, and the normative implications of that shift, of what it means to re-border when your ethos had to do with de-bordering, right? And what this makes to the EU to the idea that the EU should be a model, right? This idea that is so Eurocentric again, but this idea that the EU is destiny for others, which is again Eurocentric. Then what does it make to this idea of EU as destiny when you don't even want the EU to be a destination, right? And I think that this we should talk about in normative terms. From one set of norms, cosmopolitan norms, if you wish, to the idea of the right of closure, and then let me address the comment by Nicholas. I think it was Nicholas from his voice. I don't think the EU, the norm of stable borders and mutually recognized borders is cracking within the EU, except for a few remarks by Orban on Greater Hungary and so on, but that's I guess we can still think that this is just a blip. What I basically meant with my point is that our plate of instruments and also our plate of things that we can think about without overstepping our taboos in foreign policy is limited or it's only functional, only works in a world in which borders are stable and mutually recognized. That's what I meant. And that this world, not within the EU, but outside of the EU, might not be in existence anymore. And I think that this is really new. I think you hinted at the point that, yeah, perhaps that was something that we imposed on others, but that we never believed on. I think that's actually probably not true, right? I mean, it took a long time for the West to recognize, except for the Baltic republics, for the West to recognize new republics from the USSR. It took forever. It took until late 1991, right? So all of them had already declared independence, including Russia, had declared themselves to be sovereign or independent from the USSR. And the West did not recognize them still, right? Because the idea that the stability of norms, stability of borders was important was so much boiled into the way we dealt with these things. There's this famous, I don't know, speech by George Bush, father, of course, in Kiev in August 1991. This is Kiev, August 1991, in which he said, we will not endorse suicidal nationalism. Right, and this is August 1991. This is quite late in the process, right? So, and of course, it took a long time for many states to even react to ongoing wars over independence in former Yugoslavia, right? In what was already back then Yugoslavia. So, I think that it's a shift that we cannot underestimate to what an extent we have been embedded or shaped in our mindsets and the instruments that we have created at the EU level by this mindset. And from that point of view, I think that the shift is very clear. One last little point. I think that the EU has been a geopolitical actor for a very long time. The association agreement with Ukraine was geopolitical even before the geopolitical commission, right? It was geopolitical already in 2013. And it had geopolitical implications, very important for Ukraine, of course, and for not only for Ukraine, also for Russia, right? I think that the issue here is whether we are ready to manage the consequences and the implications of this geopolitical character of what the EU does, even when the EU acts as, if you wish, single power Europe through trade instruments, right? Even from that point of view, the EU has been an actor with geopolitical implications, and there have not been many ways in which we have managed or engaged with the consequences of our own being geopolitical.
All right, thank you. So we have a couple of minutes left. Who of you wants to respond, or shall we just do a brief round? Yeah. Okay. I know. Yeah. I got it. But I just wanted to ask Doris Widra or Federica Bicchi who wants to respond first. Maybe Doris Widra, would you go ahead and for closing round?
Okay, I try to be very brief. I think what we have seen in the debates is that the European Union has a number of unresolved issues, not just security policy, but the security of the European Union and how it can relate to the world outside, ranging from not really having resolved what the legacies of colonialism mean, to not having resolved internally how can we come up with a coherent migration policy, asylum policy. How can we solve all these issues? And this makes the European Union also so vulnerable to this hybrid war that was mentioned before. Well, now these unresolved issues are brought to the doorstep of the European Union, and already in the midst of crisis, now demanding also solutions on this. I liked what Oriol now said. Well, it was always a geopolitical actor, because of course what the European Union did always had effects outside of the European Union, and it had geopolitical effects. It was just, we never talked about geopolitics because we talked about norms. And now probably being a geopolitical actor really means taking responsibility for the consequences you affect also on a global level. And I think borders are really an issue. I mean, we have seen since the demise of the Soviet Union, the European Union really putting an enormous emphasis on utiposidetis. So how can we manage all of these solutions by referring, by trying to provide with technical solutions? Don't talk about borders. We have utiposidetis, we have this principle of international law, and this is not to be touched. So I think borders are a real issue, and this is even strengthened when we see what comes from border disputes and issues arising out of self-determination. So I think self-determination is also a rather toxic word for the European Union, and how to deal with processes that are actually under the heading of self-determination. So I think the real issue are all the unresolved businesses and questions of responsibility.
Thank you. Federica.
Thank you. I must say that this type of discussion really gives me hope, because I mean, if it is this passionate about European foreign policy, there is hope for the European Union, because the alternative, you know, could have been a very boring technical debate with no real questions or comments. And instead, I think like this, the desire to have a discussion is what Europe stands for. To me, Europe is a debate. Europe is an ongoing sort of discussion and a conversation about important things. But we might disagree. We might, you know, not come to a fantastic conclusion. But in a way, you know, I think that it even includes a degree of contestation. In the case of elections need to be contested. Otherwise, I mean, there is no political juice, so there is no belonging that is at stake. What is, in my view, more dangerous is the sort of the actions in the shade. And here the EU has been doing a bit too much, you know, in the shade. And in a way, thank you very much to the first person who intervened, and to Alex, because I mean, when we see injustices, we need to call them out. We need to bring them into the debate for, you know, for the issue to be seen and then addressed. Nicholas, does this, and Augustus, does this mean that there are some hard choices for member states? Yes, but not predominantly about money. In my view, the key currency is not the euro. The key currency is political consistency and a political discourse that goes beyond the short term, something for the mid to long term. And here, I think that, you know, it doesn't cost much in terms of euros, but it costs a lot for our politicians and policymakers, because we have seen, for instance, that the damage that has the EU's reaction to the conflict in Israel and Gaza has not been about the money. It has been about the fact that it was, you know, accompanied, especially at the start, by this petty fighting with, you know, von der Leyen going without a mandate, Varhelyi, the neighborhood commissioner, you know, announcing that was going to cut off aid to Palestinians when it was clear to everyone that the aid would have to be increased, and creating this sort of dual standards whereby everyone outside the EU is fully aware of the fact that they, you know, that it is extremely difficult to reconcile Ukraine with the conflict in Israel and Palestine. And I think that it's the political capital much more than the euros that need to be found. It probably needs more, you know, more discussions like this one. And I'll stop at this one.
Well, thank you.
Okay, as usual, the short version, just 3 points. First of all, I think the discussion has been very good in terms of pointing to something that we in social science cannot escape, and that is the sort of the ability to make a distinction between our personal preferences and doing our scientific analysis. If we do too much scientific analysis, then maybe it will sort of deteriorate into something that is irrelevant, but maybe methodological, very sophisticated, but really not of any service to society. If we are emphasizing our own personal preferences too much, then it seems to me that we can just as well become uninformed journalists or something worse. So that was the first point. The second point is that it seems to me that world politics is full of conflicting objectives. And that means that there will always be, and that is simply the essence of that segment of politics, there will always be some objectives that cannot be met. Some will have to be made a priority and others not. Then, of course, if there is a pattern over a long time that it's uneven, okay, then there is a serious problem that should be addressed, because then it's only maybe window dressing to say nice positive things. Thirdly, it seems to me that the EU's peace facility is one of these instruments that I sort of called for in my first intervention today, because it has proved to be tremendously useful in achieving the objectives of EU foreign policy towards Ukraine. It has even served sort of what is in the name. It has served the possibility of achieving a peace that can be defended. The alternative peace would have been, in the worst case, the non-existence of Ukraine today, or the existence of a rump Ukraine. So I think the EU peace facility is a fantastic creative instrument, or it is an instrument that has been used very, very creatively, because it was not sort of intended to be what it has become.
Okay, it's very difficult to have short closing words, but I think I can join in on you. I would say that after our discussion, it's important to underline there are various ways to look at Europe in the world and what that means. So we try to do this in an analytical way. I think we mentioned several tensions between such a, I always call it realpolitisch approach. Yeah, so efficiency oriented, as according to the facts, as according to interests. It's about strategies, it's about hard politics, it's about money, and it's not always about ideas or about normativity. I think that is one strand and something that we have been discussing. And I think we have been lining out attention to the more normative ideas that have been very important for the European Union. So this is sort of something that for me remains unresolved, and I think it's even more pertinent as a question than what I thought. And then there is sort of a second level that this question of Europe in the world is to be seen, I think, in economic, legal, in ideational terms, and in geopolitical terms, but in several respects. So geopolitics, again, can be economical, it can be military, it can be, I think, meaning a lot of things. And I would say that the challenge for the European Union, to me, seems to bring these two together, like the realpolitik thing, so interests, strategies, and everything, and the normative claims that the European Union has, and it doesn't have to abandon. And let me make a last point, and I think that links with what Federica said, that I think the European Union really is at a loss if it abandons this normative order, or the normative core. Yeah, if we are just sort of doing strategic things for profit or for whatsoever, then we don't need the European Union anymore. So I think the aim really is to get these two into connection. On this happy note.
Yeah. On this happy note, and to quote Federica, we need more discussions like this. So thank you for inspiring talks and comments and a great discussion. Have a good night, and yeah, see you tomorrow.